Uh, Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Brand. I'm the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to our second annual Villa Council lecture. This evening's program is made possible by the generosity of the Villa Council, one of the Getty Museum's 3 supporting councils. Founded in 2001, the Villa Council helps finance a wide variety of projects and programs here at the Getty Villa in the areas of conservation, education, curatorial support, and exhibitions. And for that, we are greatly appreciative for their commitment. I would now like to ask members of the Villa Council who are here this evening if you could perhaps stand so we can applaud your efforts on behalf of the Getty Museum. Down the front here. Thank you very much again, members of the Villa Council. Now, last March, we held the first Villa Council lecture and spent a wonderful evening hearing from Stephen Pressfield and Stephen Saylor, the latter of whom is here tonight, which is fantastic, so welcome back, Stephen. These are 2 prominent authors of historical fiction, and they discussed how they approached their craft and created for their readers a glimpse back into the past through text. Tonight's program takes up the same issue, but from the point of view of the entertainment industry and how it balances fact and fiction when it pertains to the ancient world. In 2005, Home Box Office debuted the television series Rome, a joint production between HBO and the BBC. The show has been described as, quote, an intimate drama of love and betrayal, masters and slaves, and husbands and wives. We don't get to read this stuff as museum directors very often. Chronicling the epic times that saw the fall of a republic and the creation of an empire. HBO's Rome is a richly layered look at ancient history and the building of the Roman Empire. The series was filmed in Italy and boasted the largest standing film set in the world, comprising 5 acres of backlot and 6 sound stages at the world-famous Cinecittà Studios in modern Rome. I'm also pleased to share with you the fact that members of the cast and crew actually visited the Getty Villa for inspiration as part of the early development stages for the series. Both the storyline and the sets paid special attention to historical context, though, of course, with a Hollywood edge. While the series ended in 2007 after 2 seasons, Rome now continues to live on in DVD form. Before I introduce our speakers this evening, I do want to acknowledge and thank HBO for their assistance in facilitating this conversation here this evening. Jonathan Stamp, our guest speaker this evening, joined the HBO Rome project as historical consultant in 2004. He was responsible for managing the series' historical authenticity. Immediately prior to his work with HBO, Jonathan spent nearly 14 years in the history department of the BBC, producing, writing, and directing documentaries, many of which were related to the classical world, and in particular to the world of ancient Rome. While at the BBC, he served as both Director of Development and the Head of Archaeology in their history department. Over the course of his career, Jonathan has received numerous awards, including 3 Emmy Awards, a Cable Ace Award, the Amnesty International Special Jury Award, and the Howard League Award. He is also the recipient of a UNESCO International Arts Scholarship and has traveled widely to classical sites in Italy, where he has had an affiliation with the British School in Rome, Greece, Turkey, and North Africa. Today, Jonathan continues to pursue the classics and is developing another television series set in the world of ancient Rome, as well as 2 current movie projects, one based on the Anabasis of Xenophon, and the other a contemporary action adventure based on the myths of ancient Egypt. With his knowledge of the ancient world and his experience in developing projects for the screen, I am certain that Jonathan will offer tonight some engaging stories and fascinating insights with regards to entertaining modern audiences about the ancient past. Our conversation leader this evening is Patt Morrison. Those who attended last year's discussion will recall the brilliant job Patt did with our guests, and we are really pleased she could return to host this evening's talk as well. Patt is a journalist, broadcaster, and author. She's a longtime columnist and reporter at the Los Angeles Times and a host on KPCC Radio. She was the founding host of the KCET Public Affairs program Life and Times and a founding blogger on the Huffington Post. Patt has won 6 Emmy Awards and 6 Golden Mike Awards and was part of the reporting teams of the LA Times that won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. It is fair to say that Patt brings both wit and intelligence to her interviews. I know we are in for a really lively discussion this evening. So now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Patt Morrison and Jonathan Stamp. Welcome.
Thank you all for coming, and I think we're all switched on, both of us. Jonathan?
I hope so. Can you,
Good.
You can
Right.
Yes.
If we're a little late, it's because I had to take the toga off him in the back. So it's, he lives and breathes this stuff. So I have to say, when I was watching Rome, it put me in mind of a phrase that we throw around a great deal, which is, of course, when in Rome, to which my answer was never. I didn't want to be there. And then, of course, what I did watch, I had my hands over my face about this part of the time because of the gore, the dirt, the animal issues. But how authentically entertainment portrays history is what we're going to be talking about. We'll be taking your questions later in the program, but here is the man who has studied classics, who brings a profound knowledge and love of the ancient world to media like television and like film, which aren't necessarily always very respectful of what goes on the screen. They may like to use the Mikado's phrase, something to add verisimilitude to a bald and unconvincing narrative, but apart from that, they may not be too particular. So we're going to be talking about exactly what your role is when you intercede, when you take your hands off, and how you convey a sense of the real to audiences that very often take as the truth what it is that they see, even occasionally on the most far-fetched entertainment. And so we often learn about history through films that may be in some ways devoid of historical content. We also have some clips from the Rome series that we're going to be talking about as well. But I think first we should talk about the idea of veracity and why it's important at all to the films. Why HBO would contract with you, why in the days of the studio system there were historians on the staff of the studios to bring some reality and authenticity when people might not. Of course, the Romans aren't around to sue us if we get, the vases wrong. So why would we want to make these stories in the first place?
I think there's two questions, and one is take the second one first. Why would you want to make stuff about the past at all? I think the first thing to get straight is that it's not educational philanthropy. It's entertainment. It's the entertainment business. And that's the reason that people go back to the past, is because they think that it's a very rich seam to find stories that will entertain mass audiences. I think perhaps also there's a view in some people that the past, or the study of the past in the mass media, is a way of commenting upon the present. So you could say there's a sort of higher purpose there too, if you wanted to. But it's crucially because the past helps you brand your stories, to use a kind of current term. An example might be, I think still the most successful in gross box office terms movie ever made, Titanic. I mean, that's a classic example of historical branding. Everybody knows the story. Everybody's familiar with what happens. Everybody knows what's going to happen at the end. And they can sit there for however many hours, I think it's nearly 3 that it lasted, waiting.
It took longer for the movie than for the ship to
I think it probably did. And you do wait for 2 hours, I think, before you hit the iceberg. But I think the crudest answer is why go to the past is because it brands a story. It already has a kind of currency and a frisson and it brings a sort of weight to it, which obviously creating something completely afresh is more of an effort to do. So I think that's the leading impulse, the motivation, is you think you're going to reach an audience that way. But then inevitably, even if you're dealing at the most commercial end of the market, if you are dealing with something that really happened, people in the production process feel a degree of responsibility to represent whatever period of the past they want to talk about and to put on screen relatively faithfully. And that's when they call someone like me up.
Of course, even in Titanic, there were liberties taken. For example,
phenomenal.
They had a first officer.
I should say, in quoting Titanic, I'm not trying to quote it as an example of a shining example of historical veracity on film, because it absolutely isn't. Not at all. No, I don't mean that. I think it's that people sense also that if you can say that the details are right, that it adds value to the experience of the audience, that they feel they're getting something else as well as the real thing they're being offered, which is an entertainment. But I think it's really important to be clear, which is that particularly with big movies, but even with as big, a big undertaking like Rome, that the real motivation is to entertain people, to draw people in. It's the primary, it's not to educate people.
I was so hoping you'd say it's stealth entertainment, or stealth education.
I wish I could say that were the case, and I think that maybe in some cases that's so. I think it may happen in the course of the process, but a lot of the kind of confusion can arise from not understanding where the thing is really coming from, which is that you want to get bums on seats, as they say. You want to get people sat and looking. And then if they can learn stuff along the way, then so well and good. But there are all kinds of tensions that are going to creep in, and that's obviously what we're going to get on.
We're going to talk about some of those tensions, but you and I had cited a couple of films in the past that made for good examples of talking about history and the storytelling and the liberties with storytelling. One of the advantages of using the ancient world is that the copyright's expired, so nobody has to pay anybody, to option. Suetonius, I suppose, it's all on the public record. But what about films like, we talked, Spartacus was one that we were mentioning. I mean, here is a story where it's the storyline that is what you're trying to get across to a public. This was during the Cold War, during the blacklist in Hollywood. So did it matter whether the sandals were right?
Well, I imagine probably, because it was directed by Stanley Kubrick, that if you didn't get Kubrick's version of the sandals right, then it would have mattered an awful lot. I think you would have been in deep trouble, given his reputation for perfectionism, obsessional perfectionism. You would have been in trouble if you hadn't got the sandals right. But Spartacus is a great example of a movie that's taken a historical story, which is relatively well known and relatively furnished from historical record, and is absolutely shaped to talk about the present time in which it was made. That is the whole purpose of that, and you alluded to the story already, but if you don't know the background on Spartacus written by a blacklisted writer, Dalton Trumbo, who couldn't even get his name on the movie, and it was Kirk Douglas who eventually outed him, as it were, as having written the film. And Trumbo,
in a sense, he pointed to Dalton Trumbo and said, he's Spartacus.
He's Spartacus. Now, to allude to the most famous scene in the film, I'm sure, has everyone seen Spartacus? I'm sure you have. But the most famous scene in the movie, in case you haven't, takes place in a quarry after Spartacus's army has been defeated. And he's faced up to by the villainous Crassus, Laurence Olivier. And Laurence Olivier says, I'll let you all go, as if they really believe that. I'll let you all go if you, tell me who Spartacus is. Now, of course, Kirk Douglas readies himself to stand up and declare himself, but before he can do so, I think it's Tony Curtis gets to his feet and says, I'm Spartacus, and everyone,
but the accent, the Bronx accent was a little bit.
Everybody stands up one after another. There's two things on that that are interesting about that. One is, from the one historical record we've got on it, Spartacus died in the battle prior to that scene. So he wasn't even alive. So there's a good example of an unfortunate historical fact that got in the way of a good story. So they decided simply, and for understandable reasons, to ignore that, which would have, let's be honest, rather spoiled the film. But the more interesting point to me is this is a screenplay written by a blacklisted writer, based on a novel by another blacklisted writer, Howard Fast. And think about the power of that scene and what it's really about, which is that you are fingered for having done something terrible, and the authorities want to find you and nail you. And the power of that scene is that all the people around you stand up and support you, which is, of course, the polar opposite of Dalton Trumbo's experience, which is that he stood out for his principle, he refused to name people, and he got thrown into the wilderness as a result. So he lived a kind of vicarious negative version, I mean in a photographic sense, of the reality of his life through that movie. And that's a particular example, that scene, but if you take the whole movie is a scene about the triumph of individual principle and liberty over the forces of social authoritarianism and oppression. So that's what that movie's about. It's got wonderful, fabulous things in it, but to suggest that it's a representation of life in 71 BC would be stretching it.
What about studio films for historical films like the ones by Cecil B. DeMille, where DeMille had a reputation of being a stickler for accuracy and exactitude, and yet you wonder if an Egyptian were to wander onto the set of his Alexandria or pick a place, would he recognize it?
No, absolutely not. I'm convinced. I often ask myself this question because of the incredible privilege that I had in working on this show on Rome, which was an astonishingly wonderful experience for me. I often used to think, in that rather sort of childish way, if only I could invent a time machine and go back and see how it really was. And I always felt, the instinctive part of me said, that if I could and did, and I imagined myself walking out of my capsule into the forum, that I would be instantly struck by 100 things that I'd never thought of before, that instantaneously I would have gone, oh, of course, yes, that's how it was, that's how it must have been, but which one's imagination wasn't capable of making the bridge to. And I think that's always going to be true, that trying to make that imaginative leap is astonishingly difficult to make. I think I'm going to toot our own horn and say that I think we made more of an effort on our show than almost any other attempt to represent the classical Roman world on screen. I'm bound to say that, but I think it's true.
Is it in your contract?
Not necessarily that it's in the contract, but I
you have many believers.
Exactly, I've got. But the other thing, going back to Cecil B. DeMille, Cecil B. DeMille is a classic example of, yes, he did his research, but unfortunately it wasn't into ancient Egypt, it was into 19th century representations of ancient Egypt. And that's a very important distinction, and it's the reason my answer to your question is that an ancient Egyptian would have said, I haven't a clue what this is. This is what I may as well be on the planet Zog. He actually would have been on the planet Lawrence Al-Matadema, who was the 19th century artist whose vision and color and composition did more to create the 20th century cinematic version of the ancient world than every single representation, copies of which you can see at the villa here,
or Howard
put
Carter,
together.
for that matter.
Any of those people, any of the actual study up close of primary material, writing, objects, artifacts, it was almost immaterial to the great 30s, 40s epics. I mean, heaven's sake, take another example. Look at the Ten Commandments.
Must I?
Well, no, I mean, it's fun to look at the Ten Commandments. I tried to watch the Bible the other day as well. Have anybody seen the Bible? It's astoundingly, it's astonishing that movie could have got made. You get to the Noah, and you already lost the will to live, which has to be the opposite to what they intended in making the film. There's a great bit where John Huston is Noah, and you are despairing already, and.
So some species jumped overboard as suicide gesture.
I suspect, because he sat up at the front of the ark, and you kind of push in on his face with his great beard and all the rest of it, and he turns towards the camera and he says, "Ahapeth mortar, Seth," which is, to me, a kind of classic example of non-historical dialogue. I mean, there's full of them. I know there's another one in an Egyptian movie, which is my favorite, which is "Saddle the camels, we ride for Luxor tonight." And it's sort of the idea that...
That wasn't Valentino with the title.
Again, it's the idea that this all contributes to the reason that my answer to your question would be no.
Well, part of what these films are predicated on is the idea that, like Spartacus or like ancient Rome, we have some inkling of the overall framework. So we hook our contemporary understandings to our ancient understandings. And that's why the stories are not altogether unfamiliar. That's why it's maybe easier to tell those stories. So what happens when you have a character like Braveheart, about whom there is some record, William Wallace, but the way the film ended up telling it, you would think that they just used the name, the title, and one premise of it, and discarded the rest, and took a known story and blew it completely out of the
Absolutely.
water.
I mean, I think I'm probably in the right place to give, not in the audience, Mel Gibson the good kicking. So
No? Nobody saw Mel down on PCH?
But just to say, Braveheart is a very good film for us to sort of think about, because 1995 ended up grossing a lot of money. I think probably you could say was responsible for the revival of the historical epic in some way, because obviously after it came Gladiator and Troy, Alexander, Kingdom of Heaven, 300. So it sort of set the way and restarted things. But Braveheart is probably the most perniciously rather than comically misrepresentative version of a historical film that I can think of on a big scale. It might be a bit of a generalization, but it's a pretty grotesque film, Braveheart. I mean, to my taste anyway, it's kind of shot through with all the sadism and homophobia and so on that often characterizes Mel Gibson's directorial work. But
hanging, drawing, and quartering is comic relief.
And those are some of the good things about it. But I think that the problem with Braveheart is it absolutely mangles the historical record. I mean, really just jumps all over it. And
which
you
is
could
worse
say,
than
well,
ignoring.
I suppose you could say, what's the difference between Spartacus not being in the quarry for the great I'm Spartacus scene because he's really dead, and Sophie Marceau lusting after Mel Gibson when she doesn't marry Edward II, Prince of Wales, until 3 years after Gibson's character dies. So you're taking an immense liberty there. But I think it's more that, I'm bound to say this because I'm a Brit, but it's not homophobia, it's a lot of Anglophobia in that movie too. And it happened, this is an interesting side detail, it happened to release at a time when there was a tremendous movement towards Scottish devolution. And that movie ended up playing a huge part in that process, with people running for Scottish office and pressing for a devolved Scotland, quoting the movie as an example of the high principles of Scottish nationalism.
A movie made by someone born in this country and brought up in Australia.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, that to me is slightly less offensive, but I think it's more that film combined a whole lot of things that make you uneasy about the use of the past. And again, this is a very emotive word, but it's effectively a propagandistic use of the past, and a very misrepresentative one. Now, the other thing, which I think applies to everything that we're talking about, is that increasingly now you are putting these movies out in front of audiences, particularly younger audiences, who have much less of a framework and a reference than they used to have for judging whether or not something is true. Particularly perhaps given the way history's been taught, which is just that it's been more free-form, if you like, for a generation. You've had less of a sense of narrative history than you had. And so just the simple chronological order of things, the order in which dates and things happen, isn't necessarily something that's familiar to audiences at all. So that increases the responsibility upon you. Because when you create a movie, and I'm hoping when we see the clips, but the imaginative impact that a good movie scene has upon you, whether it's accurate or not, it goes into a different part of you. You don't just process it cerebrally, it somehow becomes a part of you. And the Braveheart nationalism is a good example of that. And if what you're doing is you're embedding inside in people in a really deep way, that sort of artistic way where art goes in rather than just thoughts go in, that deep bit of you, and the message that you're putting in there is a profound misrepresentation of the past, well, then I think you are abusing your responsibility. And I think you have to be mindful and careful of that. The extent to which a consultant can actually stop that is a different question.
Because at what stage do you enter the process, too? A lot of historical consultants may not come along until it's all shaped.
I was fortunate, again, because I did get invited to join the process at a relatively early stage, and also the team was incredibly collaborative and was willing and wanting, hungry for historical detail and information and so on. So I didn't have to sort of push against anything. But at the same time, I felt that there were rules. I sort of understood that there would be when I took the job on, and I defined the rules for myself as I sort of went along as to what was appropriate for me to try and have some form of influence upon and what wasn't. So I was lucky. I came in relatively early, and I had a relative degree of control. But I know of other people who felt that they were simply used so that there would be a credit at the end of the movie.
Absolutely.
And it would say, oh, that obviously now is historically sort of legitimate,
yeah.
when actually it was no such thing. The best example was a woman called Kathleen Coleman, who's the professor of Latin at Harvard. And she was brought in to be the historical consultant on Gladiator. And she eventually ended up taking her name off that movie. And she tells me...
That's why it said Alan Smithy there. That's a Hollywood joke, thank you, sorry. Kathy tells me that the reason that she did that was that she came into her office in Harvard one morning and turned on her answer phone, and she had a message from here saying that the art designer wanted a historical reference that morning to justify the fact that female gladiators had razor blades on their nipples. Which is not the kind of, your common or garden request as a professor of Latin. You think, oh, I'll just go and look up the letters of Cicero. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. Yeah, surely they're indexed under razor blades.
I wonder which, exactly, maybe both.
And so you think that a lot of times historical consultants are just used to let the audience feel that due diligence has been done.
That's an example, I think, of exactly that. And I think that may also be because, frankly, on a big movie like that, the imperative is a commercial one, and the feeling is that it cuts two ways. It's not simply that it adds value to the film, because we'll get onto that in a second, because that has another thing. I think it's also because a director like Ridley Scott would take pride in the fact that he is presenting a valid version of the past. I mean, I seem to remember listening to the DVD extras on that, and I think he actually says so. I think he does. But to go back a point, I think another reason that it's done, and this is something I'm sure we'll return to, but I think another reason people do it is, again, the entertainment imperative. It's because the people making the movie or the show understand that there is an additional frisson for the audience if they feel that what they're watching really happened. Again, let's go back to Titanic. The pathos of that story is immensely enhanced by the fact that we know that ship really sank in such tragic circumstances. And so I think that's another reason people want to put the message out there, whether it's true or not, that you can rely upon and trust this thing, because it enhances the emotional, pathetic reaction that the audience have to it. But again, it's always saying, what's the motivation? The motivation behind it is to engage emotionally with your audience and therefore get them in. That's why you do it.
And to this stage, every journalist has gotten calls from producers after you've written a story saying, we want to make this into a film, because they're based on a true story, whether it's The Changeling or anything.
Exactly.
To this day, it gives it a cachet, and it gives it a resonance that transcends something that must have been fabricated out of whole cloth.
Well, I think that based upon a true story disclaimer is a fascinating one, because it does appear so very often. And of course, if you interrogate it, it's meaningless.
Yeah, anything can be.
What is it? Absolutely anything can be based upon a true story. My cat is a Martian. No one's met my cat.
Who's to say your cat isn't?
Precisely.
So
I think it's not worth anything, that disclaimer. But again, it's indicative that filmmakers see fit to include it.
Let's talk about some of the difficulties of storytelling and show a clip here about how when the story is so dense and you need to carry the story forward and ground the audience in what has been happening, because, for example, the sweep of Rome, the cast of characters is so vast and complex. But was thinking of the George Lucas, the first Star Wars film, where you've got this immensely long crawl
Right.
that gives people a backstory to fiction. Now you have a true story to tell, and
Right.
the backstory and the way of delivering that becomes burdensome unless you can find a means to do it. And so we're going to show you the first clip from episode 1, where these two soldiers, Lucius Vorenus and Titus Pullo, are trying to track down Caesar's eagle, the Legion standard. And they are looking for the standard, and they encounter something a little bit unexpected, and that's where the backstory comes in.
You're on a fool's errand.
If Caesar doesn't care about the eagle, why did he send us to find it?
It would look strange if he made no effort. Actually, losing the eagle is useful to Caesar.
Why would that be useful to Caesar?
Because Pompey is no deep philosopher. He will take a symbolic loss for a real weakness.
Explain.
Caesar doesn't want to strike the first blow against an old friend, so he wishes to lure Pompey into attacking him first. Pompey will only do this if he believes Caesar is weak.
No. They're as good as brothers, those two.
When Julia died, the last true bond between them was cut. Caesar has taken the love of the common people from Pompey, and that was his most prized possession. A battle is inevitable.
So this scene did an awful lot
Right.
in a very short period of time.
Right.
So was this all your idea about
No, not
conveying
at all.
this?
No. Not at all. That's a very important disclaimer straight away. No, and in fact, there's sort of several, as always when you watch it, there's so much that immediately springs to mind about the role and what you're trying to do, as it were, in recreating the world in that 5-minute clip. I mean, just a few tiny examples. You've got Ray, Titus Pullo's line, when he's talking to Kevin at the fire, and he says, "Slack as your best Narbo scortum," is the actual line, which I would challenge anybody in the audience to tell me what that means, but maybe someone can, I don't know. But scortum is a Latin word for a prostitute, and Narbo is Narbonne, the town in southern France, which was famous for its prostitutes. So there's an example of a line where you're trying to just use a vernacular, as it were, that two Romans using to each other would immediately have understood. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it's going to be impenetrable. That's one just tiny thought in passing. But the main point for me is that you convey in a little detail the casual, what is to us sadism and violence of that world, in that brief moment where Ray unthinkingly knocks the gold teeth out of the person that he's just killed. But the real core of that scene is an example of something that the historical consultant has very little to do with, and if he's sensible, backs right away from, which is Octavian, young Max Purkis's, exposition and explanation of the entire plot of the first episode, and in fact the first 3 episodes, which is, if you're not familiar with the history of this period is set at the end of the Roman Republic, it's extremely complex. There's an awful lot going on. And exposition is probably the single biggest difficulty that you face, as you said, if you're doing a historical show.
Well, think of Henry V and the churchmen having to explain why Henry wants
always,
to go to war
There's
with France.
always somebody, in Shakespeare it's famously first scene amnesia. Remind me again what I'm so... And, someone then explains, your father the king. Oh, that's right, yes, of course. It's... and spells it out for you. You need somebody to do it somewhere. I don't know if anyone's seen the Austin Powers movies. In the Austin Powers movies, Michael York plays a character called Basil Exposition. And Basil Exposition does exactly what he says on the tin. He walks in and does a pastiche of all those fabulous scenes in the Bond movies when the exposition happens. Like in the best example is Goldfinger. In Goldfinger explains the plot of the film to all the people in the room that he's about to gas and kill. Now, if you think about it, why would he do that? Why would he going to kill them all? Why would he tell them, I'm going to irradiate Fort Knox? There's no particular reason. It's not telling them, he's telling the audience. And that's the problem of exposition. Now, exposition is the writer's business. And it's extremely hard to do. And I think Bruno Heller, writer and creator of the show, does a fabulous, incredibly subtle job in finding a dramatic context in which to allow a character to do the main exposition in the scene and the episode without it springing out at you as unorganic and unnatural. You get the fabulous comic reactions of Ray and Kevin, thinking, my God, who's this? He's hot stuff. He knows what he's talking about. So you get you get lots of different twists and titches of it. The point that I'm making about it as a historical consultant is Octavian was never in Gaul. Of course he wasn't. But am I going to walk into the writer's room and say, oh, I'm so sorry, you're going to have to take that scene out because
Did they ask
was
you
never
whether
really
he'd
there.
ever been to Gaul, or did it matter?
Of course, Bruno was always asking. He was always interested. Octavian did briefly accompany Caesar on a trip to Spain, so we know he traveled as a young man. But the idea that he would be sent out into the wilds of Gaul to go and help deliver a white horse to his uncle to secure Caesar's connection with Attia is pretty implausible and far-fetched. But that's where I was saying you discovered the rules as you went. And one of them was that you don't go in and say, you can't do that because it didn't happen. The critical distinction, which I boiled the whole rules for myself down to, was that historical fiction on screen cannot be accurate, historically accurate.
Why?
I'll tell you why in a sec. But it can be authentic. And that's, I can see the way you're shaking your head, that you think that's a sophistic distinction, and many people did. But I'll explain.
No, I'll leave that to Bill Clinton. I believe you perfectly well.
But nothing can be 100% historically accurate. Even a documentary is not 100% historically accurate. And the imperatives, going back to where we started, on this, which is driven ultimately by story, means that you have to take liberties with the historical record. Because you're constructing stories that are meaningful and to which your audience can respond. That is your primary obligation as an entertainer and a storyteller. What you can be is authentic, by which I mean you can try and get the details right. Gesture, hair, costume, architecture, color, movement, dynamism of interaction, performance. All of those things you can inform as a consultant, and you can offer your help on, and it can be accepted if it's helpful, or quarreled with if it's disagreed with, or whatever else. But that is your job, I think, is to help provide a world that is authentic. And an authentic world is a coherent world. It feels like it all hangs together. So that helps people too. The details help. I'm thinking that, I know I saw her earlier, April Ferry, our costume designer. There she is out there. And incidentally, I will be saying all my thank yous at the end to everyone. But April was our costume designer, our genius costume designer on the show. Of all the craft elements in the show, which were lauded and garlanded with awards and Emmys, I don't think it's invidious to say that April's contribution stood out, particularly as the art department and production design aren't here. But, and April was somebody who was voraciously interested in taking in the detail. Because every small, tiny little detail she felt helped her create something around. Another thing about detail and authenticity of detail is there's ways in which it can help performance. Because it might give you a little MacGuffin, a little thing that helps you concentrate and focus what you're doing. You think as a performer, if you were to say to any performer, particularly people of the caliber and quality that we had in the show, imagine you are in a 21st century contemporary show and you've been at work and you come back to your apartment after a long, hard day at the office and just role play for me. And they could be in an empty box of a set like this. They would be able to walk in and there'd be 1,000 things that instantaneously would come to mind as to what they might do. You know, checking messages, going to the fridge for a beer, but they would understand their emotional relationship to the space instinctively because it's their world. If you put someone in a big Roman house, like one of the rooms out here, and say, oh, you've just come back from a hard day in the Senate, it doesn't compute because there's nothing to refer to. And that's where the authenticity, the detail might come in. There may be some specific bit of detail that you can throw out there and an actor will say, that's useful, I can see how that gives me. So I think that distinction was the crucial distinction for me.
April, I focused right on the socks and sandals look, which is going to cheer, Silicon Valley. It's socks and sandals, man, it's a whole new trend. Well, we've got another clip here about the historical intersection of storytelling and the demands of history themselves. And so let's look at this. This is where Caesar is being anointed by his nephew Octavian before he enters his triumph and presides over the execution of one of his enemies who is from Gaul. I don't know where the...
Yes.
Yeah, all right.
Vercingetorix.
Vercingetorix.
King of the Gauls.
I think isn't he a cartoon strip in... that's
He's in Asterix.
He
surrenders his arms and throws them down at Caesar's feet, but in Asterix he actually throws them on Caesar's feet.
I like that.
Yes, it's a
I
good
like
one.
that. He was, and I loved his name, so now I find out that I also like his hair and everything about him. Some people may be having a sense of déjà vu about that scene.
Why particularly?
Or the set,
How do you mean? Sorry,
where it was shot. You say they'd seen other films with
the
elements.
Cleopatra place. Well, it's the same space as Cleopatra was dragged in on her gigantic bier at Tinecittà. That's right, yeah, that great central space on the back lot.
So we didn't see Elizabeth Taylor popping around in this, but what were all the levels that this illustrated Rome on, and the knowns and the unknowns?
I wanted to choose that scene because it was the biggest set-piece scene that we did, I think it's true to say, in the whole of the 2 seasons. And it's obviously a triumph, which is a subject that's been visited in film and visual art many times. And there are sort of elements of pastiche in there, in the sense that there are references to other cinematic treatments of the same subject. We've got a touch of the gladiators in there, because of the pretty sort of self-conscious sort of Nazi reminiscences. And they're not accidental, because Gladiator itself was a sort of pastiche of Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. In fact, there's a shot in Gladiator which is direct visual reference to when the little girl gives the flowers to Hitler in Riefenstahl's film, is shot by John Matheson exactly with flowers being given to Joachim Phoenix when he didn't have his beard. And
all of his marbles.
in his chariot as Commodus in Gladiator. So there are some pastiche elements in there. But the main element in there that I wanted to sort of draw attention to is Kieran Hines's, Caesar's, red face. Now that's what we brought to the feast, the Triumph Feast. And that is a genuine historical detail.
You're beaming when you tell me.
Very proud of myself. And this is where you do get a chance to do your thing. Go away and find, there's a couple of references. They're good, trusty references in, one of them's in Ovid, and says that the Triumphator, as he was called, the triumphal emperor, the general, had his face painted red because red was the votive color of Jupiter, the king of the gods. And when you were in a triumph, you got to be Jupiter for the day. So you wore all this fancy gear, but you also got your face painted red. And that's an example of a small detail that got thrown into the mix at an early stage and picked up and run with by everybody, the director and the performers and all the rest of it. And it's a detail that really reads and registers and stays with you, I think, and makes it feel like there's some new thing that's been brought to the trial. It's very visceral. It's sort of kind of like there's a besmirching with blood of this otherwise deified, removed figure. So he's both removed into another sphere, but he's also brought down to earth, literally kind of earth and blood. Very Roman, I think. Blood, swagger, steel, fire. Those are all the kind of things I associate with the Romans. And so I think it captures that detail, has a huge amount of weight and connotes a huge amount about what the culture valued and was about.
And so once that came into the story, the writers could make it bigger than just a moment.
Well, in a way, also, as you can see, you don't have to write it. You get this lovely moment between Octavian, in his fabulous hooded, caped, cowled robe, and the lovely moment between him and the man whose power he's ultimately going to take. But it's all unspoken, it's non-dialogue, it's got these wonderful, wonderful things in it. So you didn't necessarily have to write anything. In some sense, it's maybe even more powerful for that. It's just there. And everybody, as I say, runs and works with it.
And that must have been one moment where the filmmakers were thrilled to be able to be historically authentic.
Exactly.
It lent so much more.
Just seems to work on a whole variety of levels. It seems to be enhancing and helping you in a whole set of ways.
So we're going to go from grandeur to intimacy with the next scene where we talk about Vorenus, who's going to see his wife, and he stops at a shrine of Venus and prays to Venus that his wife will love him. And then he gets home and they have their big marital discussion, which is something that has gone on for who knows how many thousands of years. And this is the moment that reaches from that grandeur of the scene of the triumph into the intimacy of the home, which is as intimate now as it was then.
I've been sullen and untrusting and cold. But I'm not made of stone. I can change. I swear on the life of my daughter's son, I will change if you would have it so. Please speak if you would not have it so, and I will leave without rancor.
It is I have done wrong.
How so?
I've not been...
The past is gone. We start again.
You could put those two on Oprah. But that was the point, right?
Yes. Yes, it is, absolutely, in a nutshell. Exactly. The reason I chose it, the reason it's the last clip, it's my favorite scene in the whole show, both seasons. Very soppy, maybe. Bruno always said he is such a sop when I said that. But it is my favorite scene. Very important detail, if you don't know, is that Niobe, Indira, Varma there, has a child. And she's trying to pretend that the child is actually her daughter's child. She's trying to pretend that it's not hers because she's had it with another man while Kevin, Vorenus, has been away at the wars. That's her terrible secret. And she can't bring herself to admit it to him, obviously, though she gets to within an edge of doing so there. And I just think that's a fantastic scene, and I think the reasons that it works are all the things that, when everything comes together and comes right in what you're trying to do in creating a piece based on the past. I think you've got those little details of Kevin at the shrine, both the way the shrine looks. It's a very untypical, unholy Rome version of a Roman shrine. His enumeration of his clan, a natural thing for a Roman to do. The fact that the background is that Kevin has complete power as a Roman man over his wife. The audience know that. If he discovers her infidelity, he's within his rights to kill her. So the stakes are very, very high. But what you've got beyond all that, which is just furnishing the context, the authenticity around the edges, is exactly as you put it, Pat, something that could be on Oprah. And that is what you're trying to get to archetypes, archetypal, resonant, universal human experience that you can track over time and geographical distance, but would be recognizable to audiences and move audiences anywhere. And that's why I love history. And it's why I'm incredibly, incredibly lucky to have had the opportunity of doing something like I did on this and to work in any other contexts that, you know, I may have in the future, but it's because you get to go through the gateway, the portal of historical detail into an authentic, archetypal world that resonates with people. There's all that kind of poignancy and pathos because you know you are dealing with something that really, really happened.
You've made your own time machine.
Well, in a way, I think when you do that, for me anyway, and I know it's all a matter of taste, but for me, That's the case. I found, and people know me, have heard me quote this before, I found while I was in Rome, I had to blog on the HBO site while I was in Rome. And just before I left Rome, I found a quotation in a British historian, G.M. Trevelyan, and he wrote an autobiography, imaginatively entitled Autobiography of a Historian. And in the introduction, he spelt out why he did, what he loved about it. And he said, if I can remember it, the dead were and are not. Their place knows them no more and is ours today. Yet they were once as real as we, and we shall soon be shadows like them. And then my favorite bit of it, because it's the phrase I love most, he says, the poetry of history, which is that's the phrase for me, lies in the almost miraculous fact that once on this earth, once on this particular spot of ground, walked other men and women as actual as we are today, thinking their own thoughts, swayed by their own passions, and now all gone. One generation vanishing into another, gone as utterly as we ourselves shall shortly be gone. And this is the best bit, like ghosts at cockcrow.
Ooh.
Which I think is a phenomenally poetic
That should have been the title.
upsum of why I love this stuff and what you're trying to get to when you make it.
We want to take some questions from you, and I'm sure you have them. So we have people from the Getty who have microphones. So if you want to stand up so we can find you and get to your questions, we'll need you to stand up to make sure that we can see you and hear you as well. There's a gentleman right there.
Good evening. We've really enjoyed the entire show, and I was just wondering, was there one particular row that still perhaps hurts or caused some consternation with you?
No, there weren't rows because, again, that's back on the rules in a way, which is that I didn't want to be precious about, I suppose maybe actually that's not true, I was sometimes. That's nonsense. I didn't want to be too precious about, particularly as I was saying, anything to do with plot. What sticks with me is mistakes that I made that I shouldn't. That bugs me.
So come on, tell us one.
Octavia quotes Virgil's 6th book of the Aeneid about 35 years before it was written.
Now,
there is also a parrot, which anybody associated with the production will remember this story. There is a parrot that was not imported to Europe until 1896 or something, and it lives in Tierra del Fuego, and it's apparently an extremely recognizable parrot. And so anybody who knows anything about birds recognized this parrot. And I got a letter. In fact, I got several letters, but I got one letter from the Ornithological Society in London. And it was a long, long letter I had to wade through. And it ended with the immortal line, "We regret to inform you that you have lost the confidence of the British birding community."
and this is the great danger, is that you have people who spend their entire lives studying, for example, a centurion's uniform.
Absolutely.
And if you get the kerchief wrong, you're going to get hell from
And
these
they're
people.
always looking for that kind of, I think it's apocryphal extra with a watch in War and
Ben-Hur,
Peace or
or
Ben-Hur.
I thought it
There
was
you go.
War.
So it is an urban myth. It's in every movie ever. There's always somebody with a cell phone or... although having said that, that was a big issue in Cinecittà because you were working with Italian extras. And the Italians also used to post-dubbing everything. So they're not that respectful of sound on set. So, you could have times when, extra has a cell phone in his pocket or her pocket underneath their tunic. And it would go off, and they might even answer it.
DeMille would have had them
imagine
executed.
You've got this kind of this emotional scene, it has something pronto, pronto in the background.
So how do you pick your fights on the large issues, or do you? Because the character of Atia, the way that she's portrayed in this, was rather at variance with some of the things that Atia really did. So do you even bother when it comes to some major liberties like that?
No, I think again that falls into, and you know, I would understand if people say I was in dereliction of my duty, but I think that falls into the category of decisions that the writing and production, creative engine of the show had to make. And you know, you can see the purpose narratively, dramatically, of a character like Polly's. One of, I think, many people's favourite characters in the show. So you're not going to mess with that and cut across it and say, well, actually, you know, she was really quite a demure, matronly kind of thing. You know, it's going to be, you always, it's bad to feel like a party pooper the whole time. You know, that you're running in with your, you know, your Greek lexicon or whatever it is. You know, it's bad enough to be regarded by my kids as a geek, but without, I had actually, there was a funny thing with
sandals,
there was a funny thing with my daughter. I got a daughter who's 12, and she came back to me the other day, and she came back from school, and she said, Dad, can you help me with something? I've got a school project on the Phoenicians, and I know they're really boring, and they died a long time ago, so I immediately thought of you.
You're in the perfect place for it. You can take her back stories. Some questions over here? Yes, there's one back there. Can you stand up, please? Thank you.
Hello, as you can hear, I'm French. I'm a French university lecturer in Paris in ancient history and art history. And your series, Rome, is very popular in France. And I have one problem when I lecture to my students, because I have to explain to them that they have to read some books and not just watch your series.
Sure.
Because I get lots of quotations which are not obligatory accurate in their essays. And I'm specialized in Roman religion, and I think that in your series, some bits on Roman religions are a bit problematic. You just displayed us, you know, the thing about Roman triumph, and I think it's great you put the minium, you know, the red color on the face, but so I have two questions. For that detailed scene, why didn't you put the triumphator with a Roman toga as he should wear? That would be my kind of detailed question. And the second thing is, what would you say to the students about Roman religion according to your series?
Could you say the second part of the question again?
When I've got a lecture series on Roman religion, and they basically, you know, try to replay lively, because you're not boring, and the series is not boring, and I'm definitely more boring. They try to display, you know, what is in the series, and they try to avoid to read the books on Roman religions, and sometimes there's problems on it. What would be your reaction if you were lecturing on Roman religion?
Right, well, I'd obviously have a different set of responsibilities, and I think that then your main motivation is an educational one. I mean, going back to what I was trying to say at the beginning, is that then obviously you've still got to try and find a way of making sure that what you're conveying is being conveyed in an interesting way. I think that's always an obligation on you if you're lecturing or whatever you're doing. But you're going to look to try and make, that's going to be the priority then. That's going to be the thing that you have to try as far as you can to get right. I thought we did have Caesar in a toga pictor, which was the special toga that he wore a triumphator particularly, but maybe we didn't. But I thought we did. Yeah. Well, we certainly went through it all and talked about it. But the answer to the lecturing thing would be you are obliged, of course, in that case, your priority is the strictest observation of the historical record and the conveying of historical detail. That is a sort of, as it were, I've been trying to say, is a sort of subsidiary element in the context that we're talking about here. But as you say, the problem is then that you've got, which is that you're trying to compete with something. And I well understand that, and it's difficult to make what you're doing with its obligations and its responsibilities as immediately eye-grabbing and eye-catching as a show like this. And that's a problem. It's maybe slightly akin to the Braveheart problem that we were talking about. You do have to understand that you have responsibility, that we have responsibilities in trying to do something like this. I certainly know that even though I have a great interest in the subject, you can go to a lot of lectures where you go with goodwill and you really are struggling in sort of 10 minutes in to kind of keep with it. I went to one where someone had a PowerPoint display and they were going on and on and on about a piece of what so-called textual recension, you know, changing a debate over what the appropriate real line is from the manuscript in a Roman poet called Propertius. And they went on and on and on about this one line. And they went on so long that the PowerPoint display behind them started to go into shutdown mode. And at one point, it said, Microsoft Windows is hibernating.
Oh, we all knew that.
Which I thought was classic. I thought that's it. And so is the audience, I thought. So.
Someone else? Let's see who we've got. Can you stand up, please?
Jonathan, we've had this argument before in a bar in Schenectady, and I'll bring it up again.
Jolly good. That's a good start.
Yeah. You know, you talk about authenticity, but what I see is meeting audience expectation. And where authentic details fit our preconceptions about the Romans is where they're allowed or where they serve a narrative purpose. So, for example, the scene of Caesar's triumph with his face properly painted red, great. But when Octavian triumphs later on in the series, he's not painted red. So, you know, to what extent are your efforts at authenticity, which we could even argue about themselves, actually only received with goodwill when they play into the bigger picture of what's going on?
Entirely, 100%, when they play into the bigger picture of what's going on. And I'm not trying to be evasive if I say that. I hope it's consonant with everything else that I've been saying, which is that that is the overall context in which the information is offered up and the information is received. And I would be frankly, as you know, better than anybody, I would be misleading you if I said, no, I can insist and I can enforce the passage of a particular detail into the fabric and the context of the show. I think the one word in that, it wasn't a question actually, was it? But the one word in what you just said that I would pick you up on would be preconceptions. Because I think that one of the things that this show did, not completely, but to an extent, was to challenge or at least advance, to challenge preconceptions about ancient Rome, and to at least offer an alternative reading of them. Now, I think it's true to say that we're always stuck in our own period of time. And the way that I might deride Saddle the Camels now as a 40s or 50s line, I'm not saying that there won't be an audience looking at this and saying, that is so the noughties. That's so the beginning of the 21st century. Look at what they were obsessed with. Look at what they were interested with. And perspective alone will allow people to see that in appropriate context. But then we're just doing what people have done since forever, which is investigating Rome as a mythical mirror, which we hold up to ourselves and in which we see a version of ourselves. And that, to me, bespeaks the point, which is that chasing accuracy, historical accuracy, is a chimera anyway.
We can only know what we know, and not, as you say, even documentaries.
We talked about the Spartacus example. You inevitably, particularly in the context of mass entertainment, you engage with the past as a means of trying to understand the present.
As Faulkner said, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past.
Right.
So, is there another question over here? Somebody? Where's the microphone? There we go. Okay.
I was curious to what extent veracity was a factor in terms of casting, because it struck me that certain of the characters, anyway, look very, very similar to at least what we know of what they looked like from coinage and other contemporary sources. So was it a matter of looking for actors who, in certain ways, had the right bearing, or taking the actors who were cast and then trying to make them look like so-and-so insofar as...
I think probably more the latter than the former, although I have to say that I wasn't involved from the beginning in the casting process. And I can actually think of a couple of examples of people who don't particularly look like they're what we know of them from coinage or historical statuary. So I think that in that case, then the bearing is everything. I think when they're all up on the podium in the triumph, I mean, not only I struck again looking at them, what a gorgeous cast they were. I mean, it's such a good-looking bunch, but they all you know, I think they hold themselves. They feel like they hold themselves right. Kieran, I know, always naturally did. But I feel like, you know, James Purefoy, who's Mark Antony, has really got his chops when he's sitting there, you know, at the Triumph as well. So.
But both of those were characters who I felt looked quite a bit like.
I think Antony was a bit more of a bruiser than that. You know, off the coins, his big broken nose, and I think he was kind of, you know, I think he looked a bit more like a, you know, a rougher, more like a brawler, a street kind of guy. James is very fine-featured and so good-looking. That's what I recall from the coins, anyway.
Did you ever have to rein in the filmmakers to say that's too much gore, that's too much filth, it's not?
I wonder. I don't know. I think it's. I'm trying to think. I'm not sure I ever did. I'm trying to think. There's an example of saying that's too gory. Again, it probably wouldn't have been. Well, it wouldn't have been my decision alone, anyway. But no, I can't think of an example of a time when I said that's too much.
Volume at 11. Somebody else? Yes, here.
I wanted to thank you for making the distinction between accuracy and authenticity, because being a professional in the field, you know, a little knowledge can be dangerous. And I watched Rome on DVD. I didn't watch it when it was broadcast. And actually, I just wanted to compliment you and the art department, for want of a better term, because when I watched it on DVD, I really appreciated the richness of the costuming, of the sets, of everything that was going on in the background. And it's fine when you showed the clip of Arenas making the sacrifice and you have enough time to actually look at the set decoration, but so much went by in a matter of seconds that I really appreciated the opportunity of pausing, backing it up, and going back to see what I'd missed as they'd walk down the street. And one accuracy question I have to ask you, though, since I study ancient glass, is that in one scene they did walk by a shop where they were blowing glass. And that was lovely, and I fully appreciated it, but I was under the impression that highly flammable activities took place more on the outskirts of the city so they wouldn't burn it down.
Well, they did burn it down.
That was before the law was passed.
Rome was... they burnt Rome down every second week, virtually. I mean, it was Augustus who sorted some of that problem out. And again, you know, we did as much work as we could. It was a good example, actually, of the benefit of having Italian craftsmanship on hand, because we were in Cinecittà, was to be able to go to people who were working in traditions that, while changed, had a real continuity with their classical antecedents. And so you could use people to do an activity. It's like the MacGuffin we're talking about, a thing to do, which kind of felt right. A big problem, as you know, with these things is extras always. You know, the extras virus, the hoodoo that extras can put on your show. You know, extras at the Triumph is all... particularly if you have to make them do it 15 times, you know, they can scarcely stand up by the time they've finished. So extras can be very problematic for you. And one of the things that we did when we looked again at the show after having shot the first 3 episodes was to find extras who had specific crafts and trades, and to find their Roman equivalents, and to put them in costume and bring them on set. There's a wonderful line in episode 4 of the first season, when Attia decides that Octavian should be fed a goat's testicle to put oak in his penis, as she puts it, to give him a bit of virility and oomph. So we had a goat hanging up in the kitchen, and for once now we asked for a Roman butcher, and what we got was a Roman butcher, father and son, who looked fantastic, proper Roman, the whole shebang, and they arrive and come up in costume. Now, here's this goat hanging up there with his testicles hanging down. If you just got some poor any extra, or me, to go up and try and cut the testicles off a goat, it would take time and I wouldn't do it very effectively or convincingly, I'm sure. Whereas this butcher just comes up and chopped them all up and stuck them in the thing and off they went. So that was a good example of using someone with a specific trade. That was all sparked by the glass question. I don't know how I got to goat's testicles.
All roads lead to goat testicles.
I'm afraid.
Someone else? Over here.
I wanted to ask where you got the inspiration for the virtues of your characters. They don't share our virtues necessarily. I think of the scene where Titus and Octavian are in the sewer, and Titus compliments Octavian for his meanness and his ruthlessness.
Salty, he calls them, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. I was wondering what work most inspired you to build the interiors of your characters as authentically.
I didn't have responsibility for doing that. I had responsibility for refining and working with the people who did. But the primary creative responsibility for those decisions lay with Bruno Heller, the writer and the creator of the series. Though obviously in consultation with the people who devised and pushed the series too. I'm determined. Let me know when we're wrapping up, because I've got some thank yous to say. So, so that would be the answer to that question, is that I might have been consulted, but I was not the person who was. I suppose once in a while people might have been interested in whether or not there was any indication from the historical record as to the character of a person, and as to whether or not that could be reverse engineered, as it were. Octavian's a particularly good example. You know, Suetonius' biography of Augustus Octavian is full of all kinds of wonderfully suggestive details about him as a character. And again, it's being selective. You use the ones that you feel kind of stick when you throw them at the wall, and they're the ones that work. So I suppose to that extent, yes, I would feed stuff in. But very often you're also looking just for the right mix and balance. I mean, Ray and Pullo and Max Perkis, who played Octavian, just kind of worked very well together. And that weird and wonderful reversal of a hardened soldier like Pullo, who we've seen do nothing but cause mayhem for the first 3 or 4 episodes, being astounded by the sort of preternatural capacity of this young man for, it's not even cruelty, it's just coldness.
Let's take one last question, and Jonathan can roll credits. So I think, is there someone down here, or is there somebody near? Let's just do that, and then we'll be hanging around afterwards, I'm sure, and you can ambush.
I'll try and make this as quick as possible. I'm a classics student, or I'm in a classics class at UCLA, and I'm here with my professor, actually. And I was wondering, on the Cleopatra episode, and I can't remember which episode that is, it might be 9 or 10. 8, episode 8. With the Egyptian influences, I'm wondering, were you the primary consultant with that? How much leeway did you have giving for those details?
I was the primary consultant, and I hold up my hand, and we basically made it up.
Okay, I was going to say there are quite a few people who would say that the details were.
I'm not going to pretend that was we went for a look.
Okay.
And I'll be straight with you about that one. Something that all the big ropey wigs and all that kind of all that sort of stuff and the heavy coal. Guilty as charged.
That was very pretty.
Your credits then, and we thank you.
Well, I have thank yous to say, just very, very briefly. I am only here in Los Angeles at all, because I live in London. I'm only here in Los Angeles because of the generosity of the Villa Council. So absolutely my thanks to them for the incredibly generous offer to...
Down in front here.
Obviously, in this case, it's not been a question of just bussing me down the road or putting me in a taxi. They've flown me here and put me up, looked after me incredibly well. I'm extremely, extremely grateful. It's an enormous privilege to be here. I'm grateful to Michael Brand. I'm grateful to Carol White. I'm grateful to Joe Giurini. I'm grateful to Ellen Schultz, who I think is here at HBO, who was the person who made the first introduction for me and suggested that I come along. Thank you very much, Ellen. And there's I can see them, I hope I don't miss anybody out. The crucial HBO is this Mara, who did all the publicity, and there's April, who we've already mentioned. I think Nika and Vidya are here, who did such a huge amount behind everything to make it all work. They're there somewhere, I'm sure I saw them. I've just seen Ilan, who looks after me. Thank you, Ilan. And finally, and really most importantly of all, actually, it was Jeremy, Gus, and Bill up in the box. Thank you very much indeed for looking after us with our clips.
Johnny Brightis.
And Johnny Brightis I didn't even see there. I'm sorry, excuse me. And last and most of all, I really have to say, in her lovely scarf, is Anne Tomopoulos. Now, Anne Tomopoulos was the executive producer on the show, but Anne is the reason that Rome exists. And it's her vision and her drive that... we've all played our role and we all did our part, but had it not been for Annie, none of it would have happened. So, again, I'm here, again, Annie, in Los Angeles, lived in Rome for 2 years. Who knew? Thank you very much. And thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you for coming. Does Michael have any announcements? All right, thank you so much.